The future is largely being shaped by a few hugely successful tech companies. They're constantly buying up successful smaller companies and recruiting talent. Between the US and China, they employ a great majority of the leading AI researchers and scientists. In the course of amassing such power, they've also become among the richest companies in the world.
AI really is the ultimate tool of wealth creation. Think about the massive data that Facebook has on user preferences and how it can very smartly target an ad that you might buy something and get a much bigger cut that a smaller company couldn't do. Same with Google, same with Amazon. So AI is a set of tools that helps you maximize an objective function. And that objective function initially will simply be make more money.
And it is how these companies make that money and how their algorithms reach deeper and deeper into our work, our daily lives, and our democracy that makes many people increasingly uncomfortable. Pedro Domingos wrote the book, The Master Algorithm.
Everywhere you go, you generate a cloud of data. You're trailing data. Everything that you do is producing data. And then there are computers looking at that data that are learning, and these computers are essentially trying to serve you better. They're trying to personalize things to you. They're trying to adapt the world to you. So on the one hand, this is great because the world will get adapted to you without you even having to explicitly adapt it. There's also a danger because the entities and the companies that are in control of those algorithms don't necessarily have the same goals as you. And this is where I think people need to be aware of what's going on so they can have more control over it.
You know, we came into this new world thinking that we were users of social media. It didn't occur to us that social media was actually using us. We thought that we were searching Google. We had no idea that Google was searching us.
Shoshana Zuboff is a Harvard Business School professor emerita. In 1988, she wrote a definitive book called In the Age of the Smart Machine. For the last 7 years, she has worked on a new book, making the case that we have now entered a new phase of the economy, which she calls surveillance capitalism.
So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature. Innocent rivers and meadows and forests and so forth for the market dynamic to be reborn as real estate, as land that could be sold and purchased. Industrial capitalism claimed work for the market dynamic to be reborn as labor that could be sold and purchased. Now here comes surveillance capitalism, following this pattern, but with a dark and startling twist. What surveillance capitalism claims is private human experience. Private human experience is claimed as a free source of raw material, fabricated into predictions of human behavior. And it turns out that there are a lot of businesses that really want to know what we will do now, soon, and later.
Like most people, Alastair McTaggart had no idea about this new surveillance business until one evening in 2015.
I had a conversation with a fellow who's an engineer, and I was just talking to him one night at dinner at a cocktail party, and there had been something in the press that day about privacy in the paper, and I remember asking him, he worked for Google, what's the big deal about why are people so worked up about it? And I thought it was going to be one of those conversations like with, if you ever ask an airline pilot, should I be worried about flying? And they say, oh, the most dangerous part is coming to the airport, in the car. And he said, oh, you'd be horrified if you knew how much we knew about you. And I remember that kind of stuck in my head because it was not what I expected.
That question would change his life. A successful California real estate developer, McTaggart began researching the new business model.
What I've learned since is that their entire business is learning as much about you as they can. Everything about your thoughts and your desires and your dreams and who your friends are and what you're thinking, what your private thoughts are. And with that, that's true power. And so I think I didn't know that at the time. The retirement business is basically mining the data of your life.
Had been doing her own research.
You know, I'd been reading and reading and reading, from patents to transcripts of earnings calls, research reports, and just literally everything for years and years and years.
Her studies included the early days of Google, started in 1998 by two young Stanford grad students, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. In the beginning, they had no clear business model. Their unofficial motto was, "Don't be evil."
Right from the start, the founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they had been very public about their antipathy toward advertising. Advertising would distort the internet, and it would distort and disfigure the purity of any search engine, including their own.
Once in love with e-commerce, Wall Street has turned its back on the dot-coms.
Then came the dot-com crash of the early 2000s.
Has left hundreds of unprofitable internet companies begging for love and money.
While Google had rapidly become the default search engine for tens of millions of users, their investors were pressuring them to make more money. Without a new business model, the founders knew that the young company was in danger.
In this state of emergency, the founders decided we've simply got to find a way to save this company. And so parallel to this were another set of discoveries where it turns out that whenever we search or whenever we browse, we're leaving behind traces, digital traces of our behavior. And those traces back in these days were called digital exhaust.
They realized how valuable this data could be by applying machine learning algorithms to predict users' interests.
What happened was they decided to turn to those data logs in a systematic way and to begin to use these surplus data as a way to come up with fine-grained predictions of what a user would click on, what kind of ad a user would click on. And inside Google, they started seeing these revenues pile up at a startling rate. They realized that they had to keep it secret. They didn't want anyone to know how much money they were making or how they were making it, because users had no idea that these extra behavioral data that told so much about them, was just out there, and now it was being used to predict their future.
When Google's IPO took place just a few years later, the company had a market capitalization of around $23 billion. Google stock was now as valuable as General Motors.
And it was only when Google went public in 2004 that the numbers were released. And it's at that point that we learned that between the year 2000 and the year 2004, Google's revenue line increased by 3,590%.
Let's talk a little bit about information and search and how people consume it.
By 2010, the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, would tell The Atlantic magazine,
Is we don't need you to type at all, because we know where you are, with your permission. We know where you've been, with your permission. We can more or less guess what you're thinking about. Now, is that over the line?
Eric Schmidt and Google declined to be interviewed for this program. Google's new business model for predicting users' profiles had migrated to other companies, particularly Facebook. Roger McNamee was an early investor and advisor to Facebook. He's now a critic and wrote a book about the company. He says he's concerned about how widely companies like Facebook and Google have been casting the net for data.
And then they realized, wait a minute, there's all this data in the economy we don't have. So they went to credit card processors and credit rating services and said, we want to buy your data. They go to health and wellness apps and say, hey, You got women's menstrual cycles? We want all that stuff. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because behavioral prediction is about taking uncertainty out of life. Advertising and marketing are all about uncertainty. You never really know who's going to buy your product. Until now. We have to recognize that we gave technology a place in our lives that it had not earned. That essentially, because technology always made things better in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we developed a sense of inevitability that will always make things better. We developed a trust, and the industry earned goodwill that Facebook and Google have cashed in.
The model is simply this: provide a free service, like Facebook, and in exchange you collect the data of the millions who use it. And every sliver of information is valuable.
It's not just what you post, it's that you post. It's not just that you make plans to see your friends later. It's whether you say, I'll see you later, or I'll see you at 6:45. It's not just that you talk about the things that you have to do today. It's whether you simply rattle them on in a rambling paragraph or list them as bullet points. All of these tiny signals are the behavioral surplus that turns out to have immense predictive value.
In 2010, Facebook experimented with AI's predictive powers in what they called a social contagion experiment. They wanted to see if, through online messaging, they could influence real-world behavior. The aim was to get more people to the polls in the 2010 midterm elections.
Cleveland, I need you to keep on fighting. I need you to keep on believing.
They offered 61 million users an I voted button, together with faces of friends who had voted. A subset of users received just the button. In the end, they claimed to have nudged 340,000 people to vote. They would conduct other massive contagion experiments. Among them, one showing that by adjusting their feeds, they could make users happy or sad.
When they went to write up these findings, they boasted about two things. One was, oh my goodness, now we know that we can use cues in the online environment to change real-world behavior. That's big news. The second thing that they understood and they celebrated was that we can do this in a way that bypasses the user's awareness.
Private corporations have built a corporate surveillance state without our awareness or permission. And the systems necessary to make it work are getting a lot better, specifically with what are known as Internet of Things, smart appliances, powered by the Alexa voice recognition system or the Google Home system.
Okay, Google, play the morning playlist.
Okay, playing morning playlist.
Okay, Google, play music in all rooms.
And those will put the surveillance in places we've never had it before. Living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms. And I find all of that terrifying.
Okay, Google, I'm listening.
The companies say they are not using the data to target ads, but helping AI improve the user experience.
Alexa, turn on the fan.
Okay.
Meanwhile, they are researching and applying for patents to expand their reach into homes and lives.
Alexa, take a video.
The more and more that you use spoken interfaces, so smart speakers, they're being trained not just to recognize who you are, but they're starting to take baselines and comparing changes over time. So does your cadence increase or decrease? Are you sneezing while you're talking? Is your voice a little wobbly? The purpose of doing this is to understand more about you in real time. so that a system could make inferences. Perhaps like, do you have a cold? Are you in a manic phase? Are you feeling depressed? So that is an extraordinary amount of information that can be gleaned by you simply waking up and asking your smart speaker, what's the weather today?
Alexa, what's the weather for tonight?
Currently in Pasadena, it's 58 degrees with cloudy skies.
Inside it is then. Dinner!
The point is that this is the same micro-behavioral targeting that is directed toward individuals based on intimate, detailed understanding of personalities. So this is precisely what Cambridge Analytica did, simply pivoting from the advertisers to the political outcomes.
The Cambridge Analytica scandal of 2018 engulfed Facebook, forcing Mark Zuckerberg to appear before Congress to explain how the data of up to 87 million Facebook users had been harvested by a political consulting company based in the UK. The purpose was to target and manipulate voters in the 2016 presidential campaign, as well as the Brexit referendum. Cambridge Analytica had been largely funded by conservative hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer.
And now we know that any billionaire with enough money who can buy the data, buy the machine intelligence capabilities, buy the skilled data scientists, they too can commandeer the public and infect and infiltrate and upend our democracy with the same methodologies that surveillance capitalism uses every single day.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry.
Zuckerberg has apologized for numerous violations of privacy, and his company was recently fined $5 billion by the Federal Trade Commission. He has said Facebook will now make data protection a priority, and the company has suspended tens of thousands of third-party apps from its platform as a result of an internal investigation.
I wish I could say that after Cambridge Analytica, we've learned our lesson and that everything will be much better after that, but I'm afraid the opposite is true. In some ways, Cambridge Analytica was using tools that were 10 years old. It was really, in some ways, old school first wave data science. What we're looking at now with current tools in machine learning is the ability for manipulation, both in terms of elections and opinions, but more broadly, just how information travels. That is a much bigger problem and certainly much more serious than what we face with Cambridge Analytica.
Bengio also has concerns about how his algorithms are being used.
So the AIs are tools, and they will serve the people who control those tools. If those people's interests go against the values of democracy, then democracy is in danger. So I believe that scientists who contribute to science, when that science can or will have an impact on society, those scientists have a responsibility. It's a little bit like the physicists of around the Second World War who rose up to tell the governments, wait, nuclear power can be dangerous, and nuclear war can be really, really destructive. And today, the equivalent of the physicists of the 40s and 50s and 60s are the computer scientists who are doing machine learning and AI.
One person who wanted to do something about the dangers was not a computer scientist, but an ordinary citizen. Alistair McTaggart was alarmed.
Voting is, for me, the most alarming one. If less than 100,000 votes separated the last two candidates in the last presidential election in 3 states, this is not...
He began a solitary campaign.
This is not a very difficult problem. They're talking about convincing a relatively tiny fraction of the voters in a handful of states to either come out and vote or stay home. And remember, these companies know everybody intimately. They know who's a racist, who's a misogynist, who's a homophobe, who's a conspiracy theorist. They know the lazy people and the gullible people. They have access to the greatest trove of personal information that's ever been assembled. They have the world's best data scientists. And they have essentially a frictionless way of communicating with you. This is power.
McTaggart started a signature drive for a California ballot initiative for a law to give consumers control of their digital data. In all, he would spend $4 million of his own money in an effort to rein in the Goliaths of Silicon Valley. Google, Facebook, AT&T, and Comcast all opposed his initiative.
I'll tell you I was scared. Fear of looking like a world-class idiot. The market cap of all the firms arrayed against me was over $6 trillion.
He needed 500,000 signatures to get his initiative on the ballot. He got well over 600,000. Polls showed 80% approval for a privacy law. That made the politicians in Sacramento pay attention. So McTaggart decided that because he was holding a strong hand, it was worth negotiating with them.
And if AB 375 passes by tomorrow and is signed into law by the governor, we will withdraw the initiative. Our deadline to do so is tomorrow at 5.
At the very last moment, a new law was rushed to the floor of the State House.
Take their seats, please. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
The voting starts.
Allen, aye.
And the first guy, I think, was a Republican, and he voted for it. And everybody said the Republicans won't vote for it because it has this private right of action where consumers can sue. And the guy in the Senate, he calls the name.
Aye Roth, aye Skinner, aye Stern, aye Stone.
You can see down below, and everyone went green, and then it passed unanimously.
Ayes 36, no 0. The measure passes. Immediate transmittal to the Assembly.
So I was blown away. It was a day I will never forget. So in January next year, you as a California resident will have the right to go to any company and say, what have you collected on me in the last 12 months? What of my personal information do you have? So that's the first right. It's the right of, we call that the right to know. The second is the right to say no. And that's the right to go to any company and click a button on any page where they're collecting your information and say, do not sell my information. More importantly, we require that they honor what's called a third-party opt-out. You will click once in your browser, don't sell my information, and it will then send the signal to every single website that you visit, don't sell this person's information. And that's going to have a huge impact on the spread of your information across the internet.
The tech companies had been publicly cautious, but privately alarmed about regulation. Then one tech giant came on board in support of McTaggart's efforts.
I find the reaction among other tech companies to, at this point, be pretty much all over the place. Some people are saying, you're right to raise this, these are good ideas. Some people say, we're not sure these are good ideas, but you're right to raise it. And some people are saying, we don't want regulation. And so, we have conversations with people where we point out that the auto industry is better because there are safety standards. Pharmaceuticals, even food products, all of these industries are better because the public has confidence in the products, in part because of a mixture of responsible companies and responsible regulation.
But the lobbyists for big tech have been working the corridors in Washington. They're looking for a more lenient national privacy standard, one that could perhaps override the California law and others like it. But while hearings are held and antitrust legislation threatened, the problem is that AI has already spread so far into our lives and work.
Well, it's in healthcare, it's in education, it's in criminal justice, it's in the experience of shopping as you walk down the street. It has pervaded so many elements of everyday life, and in a way that in many cases is completely opaque to people. While we can see a phone and look at it and we know that there's some AI technology behind it, many of us don't know that when we go for a job interview and we sit down and we have a conversation that we're being filmed and that our micro expressions are being analyzed by hiring companies. Or that if you're in the criminal justice system, that there are risk assessment algorithms that are deciding your risk number, which could determine whether or not you receive bail or not. These are systems which in many cases are hidden in the back end of our sort of social institutions. And so one of the big challenges we have is how do we make that more apparent? How do we make it transparent? And how do we make it accountable?
For a very long time, we have felt like, as humans, as Americans, we have full agency in determining our own futures. What we read, what we see, we're in charge. What Cambridge Analytica taught us, and what Facebook continues to teach us, is that we don't have agency. We're not in charge. This is machines that are automating some of our skills, but have made decisions about who we are. And they're using that information to tell others the story of us.
In China, in the age of AI, there's no doubt about who is in charge. In an authoritarian state, social stability is the watchword of the government. And artificial intelligence has increased its ability to scan the country for signs of unrest. It's been projected that over 600 million cameras will be deployed by 2020. Here, they may be used to discourage jaywalking, but they also serve to remind people that the state is watching.
And now there is a project called Sharp Eyes, which is putting camera on every major street and corner of every village in China, meaning everywhere, matching with the most advanced artificial intelligence algorithm, which they can actually use this data, real-time data, to pick up a face or pick up an action.
Frequent security expos feature companies like Megvii and its facial recognition technology. They show off cameras with AI that can track cars and identify individuals by face, or just by the way they walk.
The place is just filled with these screens where you can see the computers are actually reading people's faces and trying to digest that data and basically track and identify who each person is. And it's incredible to see so many, because just 2 or 3 years ago, we hardly saw that kind of thing. So a big part of it is government spending. And so the technology has really taken off, and a lot of companies have started to sort of glom onto this idea that this is the future.
China is on its way to building a total surveillance state.
And this is the test lab for the surveillance state. Here in the far northwest of China is the autonomous region of Xinjiang. Of the 25 million people who live here, almost half are a Muslim, Turkic-speaking people called the Uyghurs. In 2009, tensions with local Han Chinese led to protests and then riots in the capital, Urumqi. As the conflict has grown, the authorities have brought in more police and deployed extensive surveillance technology. That data feeds an AI system that the government claims can predict individuals prone to terrorism and detect those in need of re-education in scores of recently built camps. It is a campaign that has alarmed human rights groups.
Chinese authorities are, without any legal basis, arbitrarily detaining up to 1 million Turkic Muslims simply on the basis of their identity. But even outside the facilities in which these people are being held, most of the population there is being subjected to extraordinary levels of high-tech surveillance, such that almost no aspect of life anymore takes place outside the state's line of sight. And so the kinds of behavior that's now being monitored, which language you speak at home, whether you're talking to your relatives in other countries, how often you pray, that information is now being hoovered up and used to decide whether people should be subjected to political re-education in these camps.
There have been reports of torture and deaths in the camps. And for Uyghurs on the outside, Xinjiang has already been described as an open-air prison.
Trying to have a normal life as Uyghur is impossible both inside and outside of China. Just imagine, while you're on your way to work, police subject you to scan your ID, forcing you to lift your chin, while machines take your photo and you wait until you find out if you can go. Imagine police take your phone and run data scan and force you to install compulsory software, allowing your calls and messages to be monitored. Imagine at the
Nuri Turkel, a lawyer and a prominent Uyghur activist, addresses a demonstration in Washington, D.C. Many among the Uyghur diaspora have lost all contact with their families back home. Turkel warns that this dystopian deployment of new technology is a demonstration project for authoritarian regimes around the world.
They have barcodes on somebody's home doors to identify what kind of citizen that he is. What we're talking about is a collective punishment of an ethnic group. Not only that, the Chinese government has been promoting its methods, its technology, it is to other countries, namely Pakistan, Venezuela, Sudan, and others, to utilize to squelch political resentment or prevent a political upheaval in their various societies.
To spread its technology and influence around the world. Launched in 2013, it started along the old Silk Road out of Xinjiang and now goes far beyond. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative.
So effectively, what the Belt and Road is China's attempt to, via spending and investment, project its influence all over the world. And we see, massive infrastructure projects going in places like Pakistan and in Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia, all over the world, Argentina, in America's backyard, in Africa. Africa's been a huge place. And what the Belt and Road ultimately does is it attempts to kind of create a political leverage for the Chinese spending campaign all over the globe.
Like Xi Jinping's 2018 visit to Senegal, where Chinese contractors had just built a new stadium, arranged loans for a new infrastructure development, and, said the Foreign Ministry, there would be help maintaining social stability.
As China comes into these countries and provides these loans, what you end up with is Chinese technology being sold and built out by Chinese companies in these countries. We've started to see it already in terms of surveillance systems, not the kind of high-level AI stuff yet, but lower-level camera-based, manual sort of observation type things all over. You see it in Cambodia, you see it in Ecuador, you see it in Venezuela. And what they do is they sell a dam, sell some other stuff, and they say, by the way, we can give you these camera systems and for your emergency response, and it'll cost you $300 million, and we'll build a ton of cameras, and we'll build you a kind of a main center where you have police who can watch these cameras. And that's going in all over the world already.
There are 58 countries that are starting to plug in to China's vision of artificial intelligence, which means effectively that China is in the process of raising a bamboo curtain, one that does not need to, one that is sort of all-encompassing, that has shared resources, shared telecommunications systems, shared infrastructure, shared digital systems, even shared mobile phone technologies. That is quickly going up all around the world to the exclusion of us in the West.
Well, one of the things I worry about the most is that the world is going to split in two, and that there will be a Chinese tech sector and there will be an American tech sector. And countries will effectively get to choose which one they want. Be kind of like the Cold War, where you decide, are we going to align with the Soviet Union? Are we going to align with the United States? And the third world gets to choose this or that. And that's not a world that's good for anybody.
The markets in Asia and the U.S. falling sharply on news that a top Chinese executive has been arrested in Canada. Her name is Sabrina Meng. She's the CFO of the Chinese telecom Huawei.
News of the dramatic arrest of an important Huawei executive was ostensibly about the company doing business with Iran. But it seemed to be more about American distrust of the company's technology. From its headquarters in southern China, designed to look like fanciful European capitals, Huawei is the second biggest seller of smartphones and the world leader in building 5G networks, the high-speed backbone for the age of AI. Huawei's CEO, a former officer in the People's Liberation Army, was defiant about the American actions.
There's no way the US can crush us. The world needs Huawei because we are more advanced. If the lights go out in the west, the east will still shine. And if the north goes dark, then there is still the south. America doesn't represent the world.
The U.S. government fears that as Huawei supplies countries around the world with 5G, the Chinese government could have backdoor access to their equipment. Recently, the CEO promised complete transparency into the company's software, but U.S. authorities are not convinced.
Nothing in China exists free and clear of the party state. Those companies can only exist and prosper at the sufferance of the party. And it's made very explicit that when the party needs them, they either have to respond or they will be dethroned. So this is the challenge with a company like Huawei. So Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, the head of Huawei, he can say, well, we're just a private company and we don't take orders from the Communist Party. Well, maybe they haven't yet. But what the Pentagon sees, the National Intelligence Council sees, and what the FBI sees is, well, maybe not yet. But when the call comes, everybody knows what the company's response will be.
The U.S. Commerce Department has recently blacklisted 8 companies for doing business with government agencies in Xinjiang, claiming they are aiding in the repression of the Muslim minority. Among the companies is Megvii. They have strongly objected to the blacklist, saying that it's a misunderstanding of our company and our technology. President Xi has increased his authoritarian grip on the country. In 2018, he had the Chinese constitution changed so that he could be president for life.
If you had asked me 20 years ago what will happen to China, I would have said, wow, over time, the Great Firewall will break down. Of course, people will get access to social media, they'll get access to Google. Eventually, it will become a much more democratic place with free expression and lots of Western values. And the last time I checked, that has not happened. In fact, technology has become a tool of control. And as China has gone through this amazing period of growth and wealth and openness in certain ways, there has not been the democratic transformation that I thought. And it may turn out that, in fact, technology is a better tool for authoritarian governments than it is for democratic governments.
To dominate the world in AI, President Xi is depending on Chinese tech to lead the way. While companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent are growing more powerful and competitive, they're also beginning to have difficulty accessing American technology and are racing to develop their own. With a continuing trade war and growing distrust, the long-time argument for engagement between the two countries has been losing ground.
I've seen more and more of my colleagues move from a position when they thought, well, if we just keep engaging China, the lines between the two countries will slowly converge, whether it's in economics, technology, politics. And the transformation where they now think they're diverging. So in other words, the whole idea of engagement is coming under question. And that casts an entirely different light on technology. Because if you're diverging and you're heading into a world of antagonism, conflict possibly, then suddenly technology is something that you don't want to share. You want to sequester to protect your own national interests. And I think the tipping point moment we are at now, which is what is casting the whole question of things like artificial intelligence and technological innovation into a completely different framework, is that if in fact China and the US are in some way fundamentally antagonistic to each other, then we are in a completely different world.
In the age of AI, a new reality is emerging. That with so much accumulated investment and intellectual power, the world is already dominated by just 2 AI superpowers. That's the premise of a new book written by Kai-Fu Lee. In his book and in life, the computer scientist come venture capitalist walks a careful path. Criticism of the Chinese government is avoided, while capitalist success is celebrated.
Electrical engineering. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Now, with the rise of the 2 superpowers, he wants to warn the world of what's coming. Never, he writes, has the potential for human flourishing been higher, or the stakes of failure greater.
So if one has to say who's ahead, I would say today, China is quickly catching up. China actually began its big push in AI only 2.5 years ago, when the AlphaGo Lee Sedol match became the Sputnik moment.
He says he believes that the 2 AI superpowers should lead the way and work together to make AI a force for good. If we do, we may have a chance of getting it right.
If we do a very good job in the next 20 years, AI will be viewed as an age of enlightenment. Our children and their children will see AI as serendipity, that AI is here to liberate us from having to do routine jobs and push us to do what we love and push us to think what it means to be human.
But what if humans mishandle this new power? Kai-Fu Lee understands the stakes. After all, he invested early in Megvii, which is now on the US blacklist. He says he's reduced his stake and doesn't speak for the company. Asked about the government using AI for social control, he chose his words carefully.
AI is a technology that can be used for good and for evil. So how do governments limit themselves in, on the one hand, using this AI technology and the database to maintain a safe environment for its citizens, but not encroach on individuals' rights and privacies? That, I think, is also a tricky issue, I think, for every country. I think every country will be tempted to use AI probably beyond the limits to which that you and I would like the government to use.
Emperor Yao devised the game of Go to teach his son discipline, concentration, and balance. Over 4,000 years later, in the age of AI, those words still resonate with one of its architects.
So AI can be used in many ways that are very beneficial for society. But the current use of AI isn't necessarily aligned with the goals of building a better society, unfortunately. But we could change that.
In 2016, a game of Go gave us a glimpse of the future of artificial intelligence. Since then, it has become clear that we will need a careful strategy to harness this new and awesome power.
I do think that democracy is threatened by the progress of these tools unless we improve our social norms and we increase the collective wisdom at the planet level to deal with that increased power. I'm hoping that my concerns are not founded, but the stakes are so high that I don't think we should take these concerns lightly. I don't think we can play with those possibilities and just race ahead without thinking about the potential outcomes.